During the First World War, Private Henry Tandey was awarded the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Military Medal in just 4 weeks. But 20 years later, before the outbreak of World War II, another story began to circulate. He had saved the life of an Austrian painter fighting in the German army, Adolf Hitler. But did he really act in compassion? Or did the German leader hijack a British war hero's reputation for his own ends? Henry Tandey was born in Leamington Spa, Warwickshire in 1891. His father was a journeyman stonemason, and times were hard enough for young Henry, nicknamed Napper, to spend part of his childhood in the local orphanage. Completing his schooling, he found employment in the Regent Hotel in his hometown, working as a boiler assistant. And with an upbringing as hard as that and with career options that good, it might not surprise you to find that he joined the army when he was 18. Enlisting in the Alexandra, Princess of Wales' own regiment, the Green Howards, up in Yorkshire. Private 9545 Tandey served with the 2nd Battalion in the Channel Islands and then South Africa, before being sent to the continent when the First World War broke out. They went into action at the First Battle of Ypres in October 1914, holding the Menin crossroads for 16 days, sustaining heavy casualties. One of those casualties was carried back to a first aid post at the Menin Road by Private Tandey, and it became the subject of a painting now in the hands of the Green Howards Regimental Museum at Richmond in North Yorkshire. That painting also forms a subplot, which we're going to explore in a little while. Henry was with the battalion when they fought at the Battle of the Somme, where he was shot in the arm. Following his convalescence, he was back in action in early 1917, and was once more wounded in action, this time at the Battle of Passchendaele in November of that year. After another spell in hospital, Private Tandey was transferred to the Green Howards' rival Yorkshire Regiment, the Duke of Wellington's, in the summer of 1918. Having survived nearly 4 years on the Western Front, with no awards for valour other than mentions in dispatches, no promotions, and 2 injuries, the next month would be a complete change. It would bring close shaves with death, a deluge of medals, and the beginnings of a very strange story. On the 28th of August 1918, 3 days before his 27th birthday, Private Tandey was placed in charge of a bombing party attacking the German trenches. As they moved forwards, his party came under fire from a German machine gun. Taking 2 other men, he ran across the open ground, stormed the German position, killing several of the enemy, and then reappeared with 20 prisoners. Awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, his citation read that, quote, "He was an example of daring courage throughout the whole operation," unquote. Just 2 weeks later, and the Duke of Wellington's were fighting in the Battle of Havrincourt. Having rescued several stranded men whilst himself under fire on the 11th of September, the following day Tandey once more raided the German trenches, and once again returned with more prisoners. For this action, he was to receive the Military Medal. And then on the 28th of September 1918, the regiment were in action trying to pass through the commune of Marcoing before crossing the St. Quentin Canal. They came under machine gun fire. Tandey led a small group of men armed with their own Lewis machine gun and put the German machine gun out of action. This enabled the Duke of Wellington's to reach the canal, only to find that the plank bridge crossing it had been damaged and was unusable. It was now that Tandey became a hero whose reputation would be hijacked by a certain Adolf Hitler. In an amazing act of bravery, the Warwickshire lad rushed to the canal and started replacing the planks on the bridge to enable his comrades to cross. Under a hail of bullets, he restored the plank bridge, and his men did indeed cross the water onto the German side. That evening, however, he and 8 comrades found themselves surrounded. Despite having been hit twice and nearly fainting from the pain, 27-year-old Henry Tandey led his men in a desperate bayonet charge in an attempt to reach safety. The bayonet charge was so wild that not only did they manage to break out, but 37 terrified Germans surrendered. For his actions in Marcoing on the 28th of September 1918, Private Tandey was awarded Britain's highest medal for valour, the Victoria Cross. It was also during this attack at Marcoing that an incident occurred that led to a bizarre story years later. Despite being a man who stormed German trenches, terrifying the defenders into surrender, Private Tandey reputedly also had a softer side, sometimes lowering his rifle and allowing wounded or unarmed enemy soldiers to live another day. Supposedly, he gave this reprieve to a wounded German dispatch runner he came across in Marcoing. Or at least, that's the story the German recounted many years later. In the early 1920s, the Green Howards commissioned the esteemed war artist Fortunino Matania to paint an episode from their experiences in the Great War. He chose to portray the First Battle of Ypres back in 1914. And there in the centre of the painting is Private Henry Tandey, no VC at this time, carrying his wounded comrade to the first aid post at the Menin Crossroad. The original still hangs in the regiment's museum. Not surprisingly, copies were also made, one of which was presented by a former British officer who'd been taken prisoner in the same battle, to the German medic who had treated him. This medic, Dr. Otto Schwendt, later became a member of Hitler's entourage. The German leader took a shine to the painting, and it ended up hanging in Hitler's private mountain retreat, the Berghof. And it was to the Berghof that, as Europe slid towards war in 1938 during the Sudetenland crisis, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew on the 15th of September. It was the first of 3 trips that Chamberlain made to Germany, which resulted in the Munich Agreement, which effectively postponed World War II by 12 months. During Chamberlain's visit to the Berghof, an interesting incident is alleged to have happened. As the 2 leaders passed that copy of Matania's painting, Hitler pointed at Private Tandey carrying his wounded comrade and announced, "That is the man who nearly killed me." Hitler went on to say that Providence had saved him to lead Germany, and he wished Chamberlain to pass on his regards to Henry Tandey VC. Supposedly, when the British Prime Minister returned home, he did indeed phone Tandey. However, he wasn't at home, and the call was answered by a 9-year-old relative of Tandey's wife. The story of the incredible link between Hitler and the war hero was published in at least one British newspaper. By now, Tandey had long left the army. Returning home to Warwickshire, he'd married and moved from Leamington to nearby Coventry. There he was employed at the Standard Motor Company as a commissionaire, effectively a security officer, a position he held for 38 years. When the Second World War broke out, he tried to re-enlist once more, but was turned down due to his age, by now he was 48, and his wartime injuries. Instead, he ended up as an air raid warden. And he was on duty during the Coventry Blitz on the night of the 14th of November 1940. It was the single most concentrated attack on a British city by the Germans during the war. 500 tons of high explosives and 30,000 incendiaries were dropped on the Midland town. Apart from its famous cathedral and historic centre, over 43,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, half the city's housing stock. One of those homes was 22 Cope Street, home of Henry Tandey VC and his wife Edith. Fortunately, Edith had been staying with her sister, and Henry had been on duty when the bomb dropped. Nevertheless, when a reporter asked him how he felt after the raid, seeing, as according to the stories, he had let Hitler live all those years ago, Tandey replied, "I'm sorry to God I let him go." It's one of those great what-if or sliding door moments in history. But did it really happen? Well, according to historian David Johnson, no part of the story can be proved to have taken place. No minutes or records of Chamberlain's visit to Germany record the conversation with Hitler at all, nor do his records or diaries suggest a phone call to Tandey. Indeed, research by Johnson indicates that Tandey didn't even have a phone before the war, so the British Prime Minister could not have called him, nor could the 9-year-old relative receive that call. Johnson, in his book One Soldier and Hitler, 1918, has evidence from Germany that Hitler was actually on leave until the 27th of September, the day before the supposed incident. Maybe Hitler did share the story with Chamberlain, but the British Prime Minister simply didn't bother recording it. That's certainly possible. And certainly Dr. Otto Schwend vouched for the fact that Hitler had taken a shine to that painting. But why? Don't forget, by the time it was hanging in the Berghof, Private Tandey was a highly decorated, surviving British war hero. The story could have suited Hitler, allowing him to claim that Providence had saved him for greater things. And even better, Providence had provided a war hero to save him. Maybe he liked to use the story, even possibly to Chamberlain, to underline his belief that Britain and Germany were natural comrades rather than enemies. And whilst Tandey never recalled the incident, he never actually repudiated it either, which possibly indicates that he did indeed allow some of his enemy to live. We'll never really know. On the balance of evidence, for what it's worth, I don't think it did happen. After all, would Hitler really recognise a face on a painting of a man who he'd seen fleetingly in a battle 20 years beforehand? I don't know. What do you think? Drop me a line below. Because what we do know is that Private Henry Tandey was most certainly in Marcoing on the 28th of September 1918, and that his actions there resulted in him being awarded Britain's highest medal for valour, the Victoria Cross. A man who knocked out a machine gun nest, repaired a bridge whilst under fire, led his men to safety with a bayonet charge whilst himself already injured. This hero, who was actually just an ordinary man from an unremarkable small town in the centre of England, no offence Leamington, who had spent part of his childhood in an orphanage, who had inspired those around him, and who simply served his country. A quiet man who rarely spoke about the war to his colleagues in the motor industry, and yet in the space of 4 short weeks was awarded the 3 highest medals available to a private soldier. And yes, maybe sometimes he lowered his rifle and let his enemy live another day. That in itself makes him a pretty special human being. He died in 1977, and his ashes were buried by his nephew at the British Military Cemetery near Marcoing, where he had fought so bravely in 1918. Henry Tandey, VC, DCM, MM. A humble, quiet, brave British hero. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. Why not listen to my poignant tale about what happened to the VC recipients after the Battle of Rorke's Drift? It's a real classic case of heroes not being looked after. You can support the show by becoming a patron. There's a link in the description below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.